So those dollars alone add a bottom line of a 1.43% increase to our overall budget. Estimated impact, these are placeholders on contracts to be settled with our other bargaining groups, our NAGE group, which is our custodians, our clerical group, and placeholder for our unaffiliated group as well as our nurses, adds an additional 0.54. The next bullet is kind of a worst case. We put it in parentheses, increase in the retirement contribution to our pension fund. This is for our non-certified staff members. This is really a result of the pension work and the collaborative that has gone on with the town, and really taking a look at the assumptions that have been used for investment return over the past several years and what they've yielded out in actuals. So the Board of Finance is seeking, they haven't told us what the actual number will be, but adjustment to that assumption rate and some various recommendations about where we should be in terms of that contribution. And in terms of the information that Burke and I have looked at, this would be a conservative look and placeholder of what this would do to the contribution, and it would be a 0.46% increase. And I don't know, Burke, I don't want to put you on the spot, but that's a considerable increase over last year, which was about 160,000.
So, last year's increase was about 101,000.
Okay, so I mean that's a considerable driver if we really move in a different direction on trying to fund that portion of the budget. So it's something to look at as we continue to refine and move forward. An estimated preliminary look at our health insurance. We feel relatively good about that number at this point, but we may see some more movement as we go there. And you can see collectively when you roll forward those costs off of our base budget number, you're looking at a 3.12% increase in and of itself. This is where I think it becomes very important in declining enrollment to take a look at what any offsets you have in the planning process. So that's what we have listed there, or what we're calling reasonable and responsible reductions in staffing without impacting program. And you can see that those yield a reduction of over $800,000 to the budget, or spread across the different levels of the district from elementary to middle to high school, and reduce that 3.12 by 1.36. Probably doing the math in your head, it's a puts you at about a 1.7. And that's prior to really talking about how we want to look at any additions or ways we want to add dollars to the budget for the reform efforts that we've talked about. Some of the financial unknowns, some of the information that Burke continues to take a look at and report to me on are those final contracts. We have them in as a placeholder, but any refining that takes place there. The annual OPEB contribution. Final medical insurance premiums, although that we feel pretty good about that number. And you can see the list there. Don't want to read it off to you other than to draw some attention to the big one, which is the educational cost sharing dollar figure. And will the state do anything in terms of their session here, or any guidance that they move forward for us due to the situation that the state is in, the fiscal crisis that they have talked about? Will that impact us in the future year, this planning year, with our educational cost share grant? So that's something we need to consider and think about and be thoughtful about as more information comes out. We normally get some level of information, Burke, am I correct, in February, mid-February on that, or it's the ECS?
We were speaking earlier today. I mean, we learned about some other grant funding, but it's really the governor's budget process that really just kicks that off in February. So we won't have final information until much.
The timing of that is always a challenge with moving forward with your own planning and trying to move forward a budget, and that question kind of being out there and how we're going to deal with it.
Most likely mid-February, because it'll announce February 6th.
Yep.
Governor's budget, so give or take, it would be right after that.
So the next page and slide and bullets are just to kind of start to put some shape to some of the initiatives that we're talking about. So we will have a lot more detail and explanation on these things as we work ourselves through budget workshops and staffing reports, and then of course the final budget. But one of the concepts that we've talked quite a bit about with our administrators and plan to move forward in superintendent's budget are the concept of instructional coaches to support the implementation of the Common Core standards. So when you really step back and think about the impact of what is really essentially a new way of teaching and a new way of learning for our students. We feel that it's important to have some level of supports there to support our teachers in that ongoing development. And I think what a reason why we feel this is so important is we can look back in time a short time ago with something you're all familiar with, and that is when we moved in the investigations program at the elementary level, an entirely new math curriculum. Did so without the necessary supports at the time, and really had an issue on our hands in terms of communicating the practice with the teachers and with the parents. And as a result, we put structures in place, we put some personnel in place, and there were coaches at that time. Some of our best teachers moved out of the classroom, supported our teachers and our parents in that movement over the course of the next several years. It was more or less of a temporary structure, but it moved us through that, and we really attained some success from that. And if we look at that microcosm and then talk about taking that kind of district-wide, I do think it's important that we have a layer of support for people. And we're talking about either 3 FTE or a 4 FTE situation across the different levels. And we'll certainly provide more of a scope on what we feel those individuals
You're talking
would do.
teachers, not paras or anything. I mean, teachers.
We're talking about
certified teachers, so that's
expert, coaches, experts, master teachers. I think this would help to support the teacher administrative evaluation reform effort, not in that they would be evaluators, but they would be fostering conversation about best practice in developing culture about sharing practice. And I think those things are vital to move forward and be successful with these 2 reform efforts. But absolutely, Tara, thank you. These are master teachers, certified staff members. We talked about special education when Helen came to the table earlier in the year and gave her program review, and we will be looking to talk about some structural changes to special education. I think that will allow us to address the needs of both our parents, our teachers, and our students a little bit more effectively. We talked about, quite honestly, some of the structures we have in place that lead to our director of special education being out of the district up to 25% of the time, and we need to think about how we can rectify that, make people more accessible here in district to the continuous improvement efforts that we have going on. So we'll have some associated staff with special services to try to get at those structures a little bit more effectively. Another thing, excuse me, that you will see is the reinstatement, or actually the reinstatement for the first time for a department supervisor in special education at the middle school level, so that our department supervisor is not stretched over the grades 7 through 12, which has been something that had been put in place in the last 3 or 4 years and has really created, again, that accessibility issue and a responsiveness issue for us from a structural standpoint. Just grab a sip of water here. The next bullet is the Simsbury Reading Intervention Program, another program we came and talked to the board about early in the year that I think we've seen some great, early progress on, and you'll see some staffing recommendations there. What it appears to be, and we're still refining the numbers, and Erin's helping me with this, looking at the caseload numbers, potentially a 0.5 increase, but that 0.5 increase coupled with the decline in enrollment and a fewer number of students in our intervention program due to success may allow us to expand the program from 3rd all the way to 6th grade. So I feel that would be a minimal investment for what I would call a huge return. We also would be reducing the literacy interns in the relationship we've had with St. Joe's, which would be worth about $111,000 that we could offset the cost with. So I think this would be an example of you're moving the program in a different direction, you have new resources, and you try to use funding that you currently have to move that forward. In the technology, we do not have a large-scale technology initiative to move forward this year, but the dollars that we do spend on technology need to be thoughtful. They need to be geared, I think, towards increasing access to the individual devices of students. So we're continuing to have those conversations with Johnsey and the building principals as we've gone through their building-based requests. But those are kind of the key concepts when we talk about how we want to respond to reform that we've been discussing. When you put a dollar figure on that and an estimate of what those building-based budgets came from the buildings in terms of is $400,000, or a 0.63 increase to the overall budget number in terms of new initiatives or new dollars that we would bring forward to support the reform. So if you go to that last page, which is kind of a range that we wanted to provide this evening to start the conversation, and start our thinking and planning moving forward. On the extremely low end of the range, we're looking at about a 1.6. On the higher end of the range, about a 2.5, which would include the, what we talked about this evening without looking for other areas to make more reductions. And I think that can get us started. I don't know that this would be a good time probably for questions. The next couple slides really are just kind of key dates and moving forward in the process. But if people have questions now about what we've presented, we can certainly try to respond to them.
Thank you, Matt, administration. Let's open up for questions, have a little discussion, a little dialogue on,
Couple questions.
absolutely, on
Do we have a sense of the range of the OPEB contribution might be this year?
Yes. We have, at the same time that the actuarial experience study was done, the so-called deep dive that Milliman was contracted to do, looked at both pension and OPEB. So there are investment, much smaller scale, but there are investment assumptions there, and performance issues that are going to be presented for consideration in a similar fashion to the pension, where there's different assumptions affect the annual required contribution, some up and some down. So I believe that we're in the $20,000 to $30,000 range as a potential, which is we were actually better off last year when we got our final annual required contribution. It actually went down a bit. So that's the one I really have the least sense of where it's really going to go. Whereas there's been a lot of discussion at the pension subcommittee and now the Board of Finance about the concept that we need to restore that to full funding. OPEB's a little different, where you're working towards a long-term goal of getting to 100%, whereas the pension is a much more urgent feeling of we've got to get back to that 100%.
And that 20 to 30,000, is that incorporated into the 1.6 to 2.5, or is that ultimate?
It is not
number
formally there. It's part of the unknowns.
We'll be on top of that.
Right.
Okay.
Literally from the time that that this presentation was finalized, we got some information just giving us some sort of range, but no context around it. So I still can't really.
I mean, if you took that number alone, Chris, and put it on top of the math that we just did, it would fit the range.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that sometimes it varies, and it varies at the last minute, and this is before you, Burke, so that's why I was asking. Matt, you may have mentioned, but do you have an idea of roughly, with looking at the special education adjustments, what the staffing would be? You may have mentioned it, and I just missed it, so.
In terms of additions?
Yeah.
So what we would look at there is the support position would be a .5 position. It would be a position that would allow somebody to facilitate outside placement PPTs.
Okay.
So that's a half an FTE. There are some slight offsets we're still working our way through that may reduce that a little bit. We'd also be looking at a .5 increase in assistive technology, which has been incredibly successful and important element of our programming for our special education students. When we talk about the structures at the middle school and the high school, it's not FTE addition. There are some dollar additions there because they're stipended positions, but we do have a retirement at the middle school, so we would fill that retirement with an eye towards filling it with a supervisor. So it's a 1-to-1 FTE,
Right.
a little more cost, about $8,000 more because there's a department supervisor stipend on top of it.
Yep.
But it's not enormous staffing or dollars.
It's actually heartening to hear it's not that significant,
Right.
and yet able to make the differences that you want to. And just one last question. Any thoughts in terms of project choice, number of students, where we may be, what we might be talking about this year relative to that program?
Our initial planning, when we took a look at that, is we were at the 3%. which qualifies us for the additional funding with the inception of our preschool program. In terms of a planning tool and looking forward, it would really allow us to roll those preschool students forward and then replace 10 and try to keep that number stable at this point. So we haven't had conversations about expanding that number to date, but keeping it pretty consistent with where we are. Sometimes there's in-migration and out-migration, and we have the lottery and certain protocols that we need to move forward with choice. But I would say our initial planning is that number would stay stable.
Thank you.
And did the funding the funding that we anticipated from last year with the Project Choice increase, that kind of all, I don't want to say all work out as anticipated?
Yeah, we
Yes.
received our first installment of that grant, and we don't have a regular scheduled installment, but there's no indication that it would be anything other than.
And that grant is outside of these numbers as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah. One of the things, that you've brought up grants that Berg and I talked about today, and we will have in the formal budget presentation, and we talked about in public with our meeting with the Board of Finance, is how we are utilizing our grants from an allocation and FTE standpoint. So we'll roll that forward, and we'll report out on anything different that we're doing there.
That famous
That sheet, that's right. And in terms of, what those dollars are from an overall expenditure standpoint, and then what impacts the budget and what doesn't.
I'm sorry, Matt, the technology, you said not a lot of things, but we're going to put some money toward.
Well, we have a line item. We have a line item in last year's budget. I'll get close. I think it was about $240,000.
Right.
So we're not looking, we may increase it a little. We don't have a large-scale new initiative on top of that this year, but I don't want to take the conversation of technology out of the forefront, and I think it'll be very important of how we use those funds strategically to support both teaching and learning. The work of that innovation subcommittee and some of the really progressive things they have going on and the work they're doing, their recommendations will be up to us towards the end of the year, and I think will help very much for our planning for any major initiative or thinking about different practice that will move forward a year down the road.
Yeah, I also think that network infrastructure project has the existing team pretty flat out.
That's true.
Right? And,
yes.
And that's access.
Yep.
That's access. So that's
correct.
Step one. So
Yeah.
That's good.
Other questions?
Great job.
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, very helpful.
More to come.
All right.
Absolutely. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
To administration for this. Very concise and gives us a lot to think about.
Yep.
All right. Very good. Hold on to your white binders. Be filled
Kristen, you're
before-
going to love your waybinder.
before we close with budget. All right. We are now on to our second. Thank you very much, administration, for this, and we have questions. We are now into our second public audience. Anyone wishing to address the audience may do so. I see our two students there. Was there anything you'd like to contribute this evening? All right. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Look forward to having you join us at the table very soon. With that, we would just like to make note of the new revised, as of 12/14, Board of Ed meeting schedule, that you all have these dates down as we continue on with the budget process. So with that, I would like to make a motion. We are moving into executive session for the matters of discussing confidential pupil matter.
So moved.
Motion second.
Sue.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Who's going to be?
You need to list who's using that side of the board in your executive session.
Meeting Sue and I. Sue Lemke and I.
Sue Lemke. I'm like, thank you, Katie. All in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes, and we will see you on Tuesday, January 22nd, for our next regular meeting.